On the reading study guide for this topic, I ask a question about the probability of affected offspring if both parents were affected with Huntington's disease. And so let me go through an explanation of the answer to this particular question. Individuals that are affected with Huntington's disease are overwhelmingly heterozygous. What that means is they have one mutant dominant allele, which your author designates as capital H, capital D with an asterisk by it. This forward slash means on another homolog, and then we have the second allele. So in other words, the first allele is located on one member of the homologous chromosome. The wild type or normal allele, designated HD+, is located on the second homolog. So this individual, because Huntington's disease is an autosomal dominant trait, is affected, meaning shows disease symptoms. An individual who is unaffected, meaning phenotypically normal, has to possess two of the normal or wild type alleles, one on one homolog, one on the other member of the homologous pair, and they both have to be the recessive or wild type allele. Now, if I take this individual who is heterozygous and I mate it with another heterozygous individual, what's the probability of producing an affected child, or we could say an unaffected child? You need to remember that during meiosis, alleles of a genotype are separated. This is referred to as the first law, or Mendel's first law, which is called the law of segregation. And segregation means to separate. And what happens during meiosis is the homologous chromosomes are separated. And if those are separated, it makes sense that the alleles located on them also separate. So this individual will produce two types of gametes in equal frequency. Half of the gametes will contain the mutant dominant allele, half of the gametes will contain the normal recessive allele. Some of you may remember back to high school biology or maybe even middle school biology using something called a Punnett square to represent the possible outcomes of a mating between individuals. So in this particular case, I'm mating two of this particular genotype. So remember, during meiosis, these alleles will be separated and packaged into gametes. So half of the gametes will contain this allele, half of the gametes will contain the other allele. Same thing here. So I have two possibilities for each of the parents with regards to the allelic content of the gamete. So that means I need what's called a 2 by 2 square. It would have two rows and two columns. Now, we're going to learn a lot more about Punnett squares later on. So the idea is inside the square is a possible progeny genotype. So you can see that if the gamete with this allele fertilized the gamete with this allele, the offspring genotype would be two copies of the dominant allele. This allele with this allele gives me this genotype. This allele with this allele gives me this genotype. And I just want to note that these two are the same in the sense that the dominant allele is always listed first. So please don't think there's a difference between these two as to does the dominant come first and the recessive come second or vice versa. It doesn't make a difference. And then the third, or excuse me, the third possibility would be this gamete with this gamete, which would give me this particular genotype. Now, because Huntington's disease is an autosomal dominant, as long as an individual has one copy of the dominant allele, they show the disease symptoms. So that would mean that 3/4 of the offspring we would expect to be affected, again, because they would have at least one dominant allele. Only 1/4 of the offspring would be unaffected because they have two copies of the normal allele. Now, think back to PKU, and this would be the opposite situation. In PKU, if I took two parents that were affected, then all of the progeny would be affected. Why? Because PKU is a recessive disorder, and the only individuals that show the disease phenotype are individuals that have two copies of the mutant allele. And if you mate individuals that only have mutant alleles, then all of the offspring are going to have mutant alleles. So it's very important you see the distinction between the two concepts when one gene isn't enough and then when one gene is too much, those corresponding to the titles of two chapters from the Genetic Twists of Fate book. The first chapter talks about PKU, which is a recessive disorder. The second chapter talks about Huntington's disease, which is a dominant disorder. So I hope this additional video is helpful, and my thanks to the student who asked the question.